Hey champ, not feeling so hot? Well, I hope this compilation makes you feel better. Alright, get some rest. The most bizarre epidemics in history. Getting sick sucks, but getting really sick really sucks. A simple cold is like, yeah, whatever, but if you contract something that can invert your teeth and delete your eyes, it's not going to be a simple recovery. There's been quite a few weird diseases throughout history that have caused some rather bizarre symptoms. Take, for instance, the English sweating sickness. Now, the English sweating sickness was a sickness in England that made you very sweaty. First appearing in 1485 at the tail end of the medieval era, the disease quickly became colloquially known as the sweat, TM. See, they even added that fancy little E on the end. Its origins remain a mystery, with some historians speculating that a group of smelly French mercenaries were the first ones to get down with the sickness. Oh. The disease may have migrated over to England near the conclusion of the brutal War of the Roses, which wiped nearly 100,000 asses from the map. The first known documentation of the disease comes from, ironically enough, French physician fella Thomas Le Forestier in 1485. He was living in London at the time and actually had contracted the disease himself, so being a responsible human, he had committed his experiences to paper, writing about his symptoms so that the knowledge may be studied by others within the medical community. The disease was also well documented in detail by English unphonetic last name having guy John Keyes in 1552. Yeah, this illness lasted a while. Building off of the pre-modern miasma theory, it was widely believed that most diseases, not just the sweating sickness, spread through what they referred to as corrupt air. Well, if there's anything you know about medieval England, you know that it was stanky. Streets were filthy, water was gooped with poop, and the air could curl your nose hairs. Until the Great Stink of 1858, proper sanitation just really wasn't given much attention. While miasma theory was flat out wrong, some alternate propositions were a bit more off base. Some theories pointed to astrological origins for the disease. Some blamed Mars, others blamed Saturn. Keyes himself blamed the stars. In one of his detailed reports, he said, quote, "To this may be joined the evil disposition by constellation, which hath a great power and dominion in all earthly things." But we of course know that astrology is a bunch of big brown baloney. Now, I firmly trust that you have the critical thinking skills to realize that the English sweating sickness's iconic symptom was impromptu perspiration. I mean, sweat just started flooding out of every pore, with physicians noting the startling and alarming suddenness of it all. Along with dripping out of your skin holes, the infected came down with immediate and strong existential dread, with crippling fear and anxiety. This was further accompanied by violent shivering, pounding headaches, and overall exhaustion. The profuse sweating caused extreme dehydration, intense thirst, and heart palpitations. One of the deadliest symptoms, as innocent as it may seem, was the overwhelming urge to sleep. This was the telltale sign that the disease had reached its endgame. Physicians were given extreme caution to not let their patients fall asleep, lest they wake up in a cleaner, cloudier afterlife.
Wake up!
Now, all of this, the sweating, chills, fears, sleepiness, death, all that, happened within just 24 hours of initial infection. A single day to go from alrighty to nighty-nighty. Le Forestier himself had documented even more rapid deterioration, with death in as little as 3 hours from initial symptoms. This stuff was nasty and terrifying. Surviving the first 24 hours, if you were even lucky enough to do that, usually meant that you would be in the clear, but historical records estimate a fatality rate of 30 to 50%. This also was not a one-time occurrence. The English sweating sickness made its mark on history a total of 5 different times, first starting in 1485 and making a final appearance in 1551. The worst of it came in 1528, where it spread across most of Europe within months, hilariously skipping over and completely sparing France, whom I mentioned, may have started the whole thing. All in all, tens of thousands of people had died. Here's the kicker though, widespread diseases like this typically target the weak, the destitute, deprived, and downright downtrodden, right? Well, according to Le Forestier and Keyes, the largest affected demographic wasn't scrawny peasant kids or dilapidated elders. No. The English sweating sickness instead seemed to target middle-aged, healthy, wealthy men. The theory is that this demographic was more social and confined to smaller communal environments, allowing for easier transmission.
How fares the day, my good man?
Pretty moist, Tom. Pretty moist. Hola, Mexico. Looks like you're up to bat for a weird disease. Right around the time that the English perspiration meant English expiration in the mid-16th century, the Mexica were getting shaken up by the Cocolitzli epidemics. The term Cocolitzli here being the equivalent of pestilence in the Nahuatl language. If you watched my video about surviving the Aztec Empire, you know that funny little TL pronunciation, the sound, is on purpose. What's slightly less funny though were the estimated 12 to 15 million deaths attributed to these epidemics, the deadliest in Mexican history. Now this all took place across the Mexican plateau, right in this region here, but it is known to have spread as far as modern-day Guatemala. The first signs of the disease began to show up around 1545 in the Valley of Mexico, right in the heart of what used to be the Aztec Empire. As you know, the Spanish came along in 1519 and essentially converted the once thriving empire into a Walmart parking lot in just 2 years flat. In addition to using superior weaponry and strategic alliances with neighboring societies to steamroll the Aztecs, the Spanish also brought with them an unintentional biological advantage: smallpox. This took a healthy chunk out of the Mexica population, killing off roughly 8 million people, or roughly a third of the whole dang thing in 1520. But 25 years later, the Cocolitzli decided it wanted to pump those rookie numbers up. Like the English sweating sickness, the symptoms of Cocolitzli were immediate and severe. You were in the thick of it within just a few hours at most. Initial symptoms included high fever, headaches, and intense vertigo. You know, similar to that spinny feeling you get when them beers start looking a little too friendly.
Drink us, you know you want to.
You got it, mister. Please drink responsibly. Beer cans don't talk. It's just too dang bad that these rather simple symptoms would soon evolve into complete horror. During the ominously named hemorrhagic stage, victims would begin bleeding out of every single orifice they owned. Your eyes, your ears, your nose, your mouth, even your beehole and hoo-ha or dangly bits all the way down south. Coupled with excruciating abdominal and chest pain as well as painful swelling underneath the skin, this was just an actual nightmare. The Mexica and the Spanish tried their best to treat the sick, but nothing was working. The Spanish tried quarantining the ill, bloodletting, and even the most powerful remedy of all, thoughts and prayers. The Mexica tried various herbal medicines and their own spiritual healing practices, but it was all in vain. People were simply dying too quickly. The infected could suffer in utter agony for up to 4 days before finally experiencing some relief, because they died. During its initial release in 1545, Cocolitzli ravaged the Mexica population, culling around 80% of the herd. The sequel hit the shelves in 1576. This version was slightly less deadly, but still terrifying all the same. It cut down the remaining Mexica population by an additional 50% before burning itself out in 1580. Within just 56 years, the entire Mexica population had fallen from about 22 million down to less than 2 million. Now, the Spanish were still affected, but not nearly to the extent of the Mexica. This was mainly due to the fact that the Mexica were more susceptible with their more exhaustive labors and poorer nutrition than that of their Spanish counterparts. Their immune systems were weaker, so the disease pressed the advantage. Modern hypotheses point their fingers to either an alternate form of salmonella, some kind of rodent-borne fever, or a conglomeration of various diseases that just so happen to strike all at once. But to me, that just sounds like a giant, I don't know. What is mostly agreed upon, however, is that it's highly unlikely that Cocolitzli was a Spanish-borne disease, simply because the pathogenesis was drastically different compared to that of known European diseases, so it was just probably something local. More like home field disadvantage. Let's jump back from a society known for ripping out hearts to one that wants to lick the inside of your skull. These are the Foray. They live in a small province right at the base of the shaft of the country of Papua New Guinea. Being a remote society, they pretty much remained uncontacted by foreigners up until around the early 1940s when the Pacific theater of World War II began to boom. Once they were properly contacted, the foreigners did what foreigners do best. They showed up and started shifting the culture. Australian explorers had introduced the Foray people to the concept of hygiene and the establishment of constructing dedicated roads for quicker and safer travel. Pretty good way to nudge a developing community in the right direction. Another colonial influence was to deviate from rather primitive foray activities like village warfare. I know, kinda hypocritical, right? Well, there was also a push to abandon many traditional values, one of which being endo-cannibalism. Now, this wasn't a savage beat your buddy over the head then drag your teeth across his face type cannibalism. This was a mourn your buddy because he just died from natural causes, then drag your teeth across his face type cannibalism. Very different. Unfortunately for the foray, disease does not abide by rules of respect and ritual. Biting a brain is biting a brain, which is exactly where Kuru came from, a fatal and completely incurable neurodegenerative disorder. Stemming from the consumption of infected brain tissue, Kuru is a prion disease. Now this is where biology is just crazy to me. Alright, so here, this is a simple protein. It's multifunctional in nature, repairs cells, builds muscles, whatever you want it to do within reason. But if in the highly unlikely case that it decides to fold in on itself in a weird way, it becomes a prion, completely rewriting its entire biological mechanism. Now instead of being a universal helper, it just turns everything to shit. For the case of Kuru, these prions mess with the neurological function and make your brain go all stupid, causing unusual, involuntary symptoms. The moment a person is infected, the biological clock starts ticking. Dr. Carlton Gajdusek, who is the first to discover the disease in 1957, and who also has a very disturbing history of convictions that I will not go into here, observed over 200 Kuru cases and recorded the stages of their progression. Because of cultural practices, it was mainly women and children who took the brunt of the illness. That's because foray women were responsible for preparing the remains for whoever was gonna be on the menu that day. Women and children feasted on the more tender, tasty, and nutritious organs, like the brain. The men pretty much sat on the sideline and watched.
You guys want some?
Nope, nah, we're good. According to Dr. Gajdusek, the earliest telltale sign of an infection was the simple loss of balance or coordination. This was followed up by slight twitches and the occasional headache. These symptoms were minor, with the infected still being able to walk and function independently. For now. After a few months, the neurological deterioration became much more evident. A few stumbles here and there quickly evolved into frequent falls, and villager demeanors were shifting entirely. Victims at the intermediate stage experienced drastic mood swings, from fearful and anxious to aggressive and agitated. There was also the disease's signature, an uncontrollable, unnerving laughter. At this point, the writing was pretty much on the wall. Crawl forward a few more months, and the infected were completely bedridden. They can't think, they can't talk, they have zero control over their own bodies. A side effect of that is the inability to eat or drink anything properly. You know, you need coordinated expansion and contraction of muscles to swallow food or have a little sippy sip. If the Kuru didn't kill you, the malnutrition would. So when you think about it, the very violent but quick deaths earlier in this list were a blessing in disguise. Sure, you were blasting blood out your back door, but at least you was only doing it for an afternoon. With Kuru, you were just wasting away over the course of several months, unable to do anything about it. Death occurred usually within a year of initial symptoms. Even today, there is no known cure for prion disease. So until then, maybe hold off on the cranium crunching. Now, I just know that some of you have been hoping that this was on the list. The Dancing Plague of Strasbourg is one of those events where, as bizarre as it was, countless credible eyewitnesses all completely agree on exactly what happened. They just have zero friggin' explanation of exactly why it happened. So yeah, this all took place in Strasbourg in the Alsace region of what is now modern-day France. I've actually been there. See this? I took this picture. See how beautiful it is there? Back in July of 1518, however, Strasbourg was part of the Holy Roman Clusterfuck. It was actually a very important part, serving as a strategic, wealthy, and politically independent city for over 400 years. That's 1.6 Americas long. Well, with it being such a crucial entity of the empire, it'd be pretty embarrassing if some kind of weird phenomenon swept through and disrupted things. What are you doing? Whatever do you mean? Come on, kids, we're leaving. According to this Wikipedia article I just found laying on the ground, a lovely lady named Tropea decided to start throwing it back right outside her home in the middle of the day. Seems innocent enough at first, but she just didn't stop. Save for a few frantic meal breaks or collapses from exhaustion, Tropea let loose for several days. Instead of scaring them off, all of her dancing actually encouraged many of her fellow Strasburgers to join in. She's good. And thus, the plague had spread. Now, you might assume that these onlookers were just doing a tad bit of toe tapping, but you'd be very wrong. They were really pushing the limits of their tendons' tensile strength as they were whipping their limbs to and fro, basically Beyblading themselves around the street and letting them rip. Now, going alls out, balls out dancing can be fun for about 30 seconds, but when it goes on for days, that's when mental and physical health starts to trend downward. From a distant perspective, watching everyone doing their shimmy shams looks like a good time, but once you got closer, you realized that something was horribly wrong. The enthusiastic dancers reportedly held an empty but panicked expression, as if they were being puppeted by some unknown force. The dead stare of unbridled torture, coupled with these medieval peasants quite literally dancing their feet to the bone, warranted intervention, especially when 15 were dancing themselves into a freshly dug grave each and every day.
Oh, we need to do something.
Everyone was quick to offer their suspicions. The church blamed evil spirits, the doctors blamed hot blood, neither of which offered any proper solution. Very helpful. Taking matters into their own hands, city officials attempted the reverse psychology route, setting up stages and hiring musicians to provide a proper venue for the dancers, encouraging the wacky rascals to keep on dancing. And they did. At the peak of its spread, over 400 people were getting jiggy with it. Some doing it thanks to a crippling psychogenic illness, and others just because it looked like fun. But after a while, the fun was done. After 2 months of the plague, it started to die down, mostly because the actual sick people cha-cha slid into the great beyond, taking it to the top with one hop. Anybody else just in it for the bit kinda went on with their lives. Any remaining dancers were promptly carted off for spiritual cleansing, which reportedly worked thanks to a little thing called the placebo effect. In the end, while this may have been a simple case of mass hysteria brought on by the harsh stresses of just existing in medieval Europe, some historians blame bad bread. Ergotism, a fungal poisoning originating from contaminated grain, does exhibit symptoms ranging from hallucinations to uncontrollable convulsions, so sure, why not? Just remember, if you ever see someone dancing by themselves in public, they're either an insufferable influencer or on drugs. Or both. Probably both. Horrifying Victorian fashion trends. The Victorian age. Great Britain's King William IV dies a death in 1837 and his 18-year-old niece Victoria takes the throne. This era marked a huge turning point in the history of the British Empire. Slavery had just been abolished, stricter labor laws were seeing less children getting smeared in gears, industry was booming, and literacy and education were on the rise. Sure, there was still overwhelming poverty and disease, but, one step at a time. Another aspect that became a main focal point during the Victorian age was that of modesty. Ironically enough, the idea of modesty, at least for the upper class, was flexing as much wealth as possible. The easiest way to do that was by how you dressed. It was a quick way to tell anyone crossing your path what your status was. For instance, when you're out in public and you see a dude decked out in Supreme brand everything, you know without a doubt that that guy is a douche. You know when you watch movies or shows that depict the rich and the royals and you always see them wearing those big bulky dresses? Well, they were a very real fashion trend in the mid-19th century. Women would have layer after layer of dress slammed onto them to achieve that iconic bell-shaped look. I mean, these things were sometimes up to 8 layers thick, so while dudes were rocking simple coats and slacks, some women were drowning in their dresses, which, depending on the material type, could weigh upwards of 30 pounds. Help! Thankfully, in 1856, a Parisian inventor came through with a product designed to lighten the load, the crinoline cage. A large brace fitted under a single dress layer that gave all of the desired poof with far less pain. Reducing the overall weight burden by up to 75%, the structure was fashioned from lightweight steel rings strapped together to form the desired shape. With less layers to worry about, dresses could be exaggerated further with wider, fuller, and frankly ridiculous proportions, with dresses commonly reaching up to 6 feet in diameter. I mean, them things at girth. It wasn't long until the crinoline craze completely flooded the market, and thanks to that whole industrial revolution thing going on, articles of clothing that took weeks of handcrafting could now be mass-produced for pence on the pound, meaning that even higher-end fashion could be enjoyed across all societal classes, albeit with cheaper materials. But while the dresses offered women a more acceptable mobility to style ratio, it came with a few inherent dangers. The first and most obvious was the sheer size. Although they were looking fine as hell, women found the dresses to be flat out inconvenient. Getting on and off public transportation, taking up space in small shops and rooms, constant trips and falls, it became a public nuisance. In an act of horrible judgment, some women took the trend into the workplace. The highly industrialized, full of moving parts workplace. Now, if you're familiar with any videos watermarked with a Live Leak logo, you know that loose fabric and heavy machinery do not mix. According to an 1864 Irish newspaper, a young worker woman passed by an unguarded, steam-powered 4-inch mechanical shaft. Her dress was snagged and she was instantly entangled and mangled in the shaft for 3 whole minutes before the machine could be stopped. Oops. Her spine was snapped in multiple spots and she died shortly after. Now, since mangled corpses can negatively affect productivity, factories began banning the dresses on the floor. The other danger, of course, was fire. You know, that very element that drove every aspect of human life at the time. Heat, fireplaces, light, oil lamps and candles, machinery, steam boilers. Fire was everywhere, and these crinoline-clad ladies were essentially walking kindling. Now, thousands, I shit you not, thousands of deaths were recorded as a result of crinoline dresses catching fire and engulfing their wearers. So while there were documented deaths on the individual level, like 14-year-old kitchen maid Margaret Davy, whose dress ignited while reaching for spoons on a fireplace mantle, or 16-year-old Emma Musson, who burst into flames after a spark from a nearby kitchen fire landed on her dress, there was perhaps the most infamous incident involving the crinoline dresses, one that didn't even occur in Great Britain. On December 8, 1863, a fire broke out in La Iglesia de la Compañía de Jesús in Santiago, Chile. Yeah, I took Spanish in high school. The death toll was estimated to be between 2,000 to 3,000 people, with the overwhelming amount of those deaths being credited towards the crinoline dresses that most of the women were wearing that night. Yeah, they weren't the direct cause of the fire, but with so many poofily dressed women fleeing towards the exit at once, people were tripping left and right, frantically trampling over each other's bodies in an attempt to save their own lives. The fire quickly swept across the flammable fabric masses, consuming the crowd. A wall of human bodies blocked the only exit, trapping any hopeful survivors inside before the entire roof caved in on them. Yeah, you didn't think a story about dresses would get this tragic, did you? Luckily, people began to realize the downside of the fashion trend, and by the late 1860s, just over a decade after its appearance on the market, crinoline dress shapes began to shrink, shifting any junk to the trunk. Slimmer and much more manageable dress sizes became the standard with the rise of the bustle in the 1870s, much to the dismay of the local undertakers.
You stupid.
The last thing you want to think of after proudly painting your house is,
Did I just poison my entire family?
unfortunately, that's a question that many fellas in the 1800s had to ask themselves. Also why they had the audacity to paint their walls green. But not just any green, Sheila's green. Invented in 1775 by one world-renowned Swedish chemist, Carl Wilhelm Scheele. That's Sheila, like the tank. This guy had a huge amount of discoveries under his big smelly belt, including various elements like barium, tungsten, chlorine, and even oxygen. During one of his daily routines of faffing about with various dangerous chemicals, he managed to accidentally create the new pigment.
Damn, that's green as fuck.
Carl spent the next few years perfecting the synthesis and formally published the recipe in 1778, though he warned of some potential health issues down the line should it be mass-produced. You see, this shade of green was made from acidic copper arsenite. Arsenite? That sounds like arsenic. Yes it does, 'cause it is. Although very toxic, it was believed at the time that only those who directly ingested this stuff would be susceptible to its side effects, and you wouldn't slam down a big bucket of tasty green goop, would you? No. After inventing the shade of green, Scheele unfortunately turned a shade of blue as he passed on from this world in 1786 at the age of 43, luckily before seeing the consequences of his creation. With the recipe now published, manufacturers were looking to turn that green into gold. And by the early 1800s, Sheila's green was used as a colorant in a wide variety of products, including dyes, paints, books, wallpapers, dresses, and of course, children's toys. Yeah, everyone wanted their own bit of green. Hell, even Queen Victoria herself had her own green wallpaper to admire. With such substantial demand, factories pushed their workers hard to meet that quota. And this is when the health risks became apparent. Factory fellows working with the arsenical dye reported various sores and symptoms related to arsenic poisoning, though they were largely dismissed or silenced. In the late 1850s, medical reports began circulating highlighting reports of arsenic poisoning from wallpaper. Now, homes back in the day didn't have the sophisticated climate control we have now, especially when it comes to humidity. So a common problem with wallpaper was that it would get all moist and moldy. When this happened, the wallpaper would let off a toxic arsine gas, which slowly poisoned the homeowners. The paper was also susceptible to flaking, with bits of green getting snorted into your airways and into your lungs, and that's no good either. While toxic, arsenic also has the bonus property of being carcinogenic. Gives you cancer. It's estimated that thousands of people were either dead or dying from arsenic poisoning across the early and mid 1800s. People got sick, but knowledge surrounding arsenic poisoning itself was not clearly defined, so doctors often misdiagnosed the ailments, attributing them to something entirely different. Hi, well, there's a problem, boyo. You've been fingering too many leprechauns. Hi, so true. But the nail in the chromatic coffin came in 1861 with 19-year-old Matilda Schurer. She was a flower maker. With the boom of industry on everyone's doorstep and their surroundings getting grayer, browner, and sadder, people yearned for the reminders of the brilliant colors of nature, mainly flowers. So naturally, this opened up the market for artificial flowers. An element of the false bouquets were leaves. What color are leaves? No, come on, tell me, what color? Green, that's right. Sheila's green dyes were dustified and applied to fabric leaves to give them that vibrancy. Well, just like the flaking wallpaper, that dust nestled itself in workers' internals, causing crippling illness. Matilda reportedly had oozing sores across her skin where she handled the dust, with the whites of her eyes turning green and even violently vomiting bright green liquid. She sadly died on November 20th, 1861. With all these green symptoms, doctors could no longer ignore the reality. Sheila's green was deadly. Word spread and consumers dropped their green goods. Dresses were dumped, wallpapers were ripped from their walls. By the 1870s, manufacturers were forced to use less vibrant but arsenic-free greens in their products. It's not easy being green. Jumping back to the theme of prim and proper fashion in the Victorian age, one way to appear as an upstanding member of society was to keep your head up. Literally. A straightened posture was praised amongst the societal types. But why train yourself to keep your neck straight when you could just have your clothes do it for you? This is where the stiff high collar came in, and for a while, it had a chokehold on men's fashion. While giving fantastic circulation restricting support, it also served a secondary purpose of providing its wearer with a crisp and clean appearance. You see, with the many layers of Victorian fashion, undershirts were mostly covered up, save for around the length of your neck. Getting your clothes cleaned was expensive and time-consuming. Why clean a shirt that barely anyone sees anyway, when you could just give the illusion of cleanliness? High collars were detachable by design, so instead of washing an entire shirt, you just needed the collar to look clean. The collars were ironed and heavily starched, making them extremely rigid, able to keep your chin up even if you're feeling down. Oh. But these restrictions and constrictions led to some afflictions. For one, these things were just plain uncomfortable. By the late 1800s, the collars pretty much reached the jawline, further exaggerating the posture to the point of ridiculousness and therefore danger. Even physicians at the time warned of the inherent problems of the collars, including their tendency to put too much pressure on the carotid arteries. Those are the ones that supply blood to your brain. Don't want to be blocking them things. Although a rare occurrence, it was still a risk. Unfortunately, it was a risk that took the lives of a few unlucky gents. In September of 1888, a young fella by the name of John Cruzy drunkenly passed out on a bench one night in Druid Hill Park in Baltimore, Maryland. According to his autopsy, John was slumped over with his head drooping forward, pushing his stiff high collar into his neck, which cut off his air supply and choked him to death. There was also the case of William Dillon, who was found dead in his hotel room. He died from asphyxiation after severe indigestion had swollen his neck in his sleep, compressing it to his collar. Yeah, it's a completely stupid way to go, but fashion back then was more about class than comfort. Luckily, the age of the stiff high collar was about to fold. Shifts towards more casual, comfortable clothing began to take hold in the 1920s and the 1930s. You also had the electric washing machine make its way to market around the same time, so dirtbags could now clean their shirts and no longer needed their collars. Thankfully, the high collar remained out of the spotlight for a while. But then that shit came back to haunt us in the 2000s. God, I could practically smell the Axe body spray. Now this is a well-known one when discussing deadly fashion trends. After all, the whole phrase "mad as a hatter" came from the Victorian era. With the extravagance and intricacies of elaborate outfits in that time, you also needed to accessorize. That meant wearing a fancy-ass hat on your fancy-ass head. So the hat business was brimming with eager customers. You had tall hats, small hats, even sailor straw hats, sun hats, wide hats, flowered hats, and side hats. Some hats for him, some hats for her. Hats stacked with feathers and even ones with fur. There were endless choices for a fashionable head. It's just a shame that many of their makers were gonna wind up dead. The art of hat making was tedious and dangerous, not just because of needles and such, but the chemical processes involved. Yeah, nothing was really safe from harsh chemicals in those days. One of the most common materials used to make hats was felt. If you're unaware, felt is basically fibers matted together and compressed into a single material. In order to do this reliably and quickly in the 1800s, a process called kerating was performed. Animal pelts, usually beaver or rabbit, would be saturated in a mercuric nitrate solution. This allowed the fibers to separate from the hides and make them more pliable and more easily formed into the sheets of felt. This process also turned the furs a dark orange color, hence the name kerating. Ooh, pretty. If you are a frequent watcher of my stuff, which you should be, you know that I've gone into detail about mercury poisoning before, but let's refresh. Mercury vapors from the kerating process were, obviously, very toxic. This excessive, prolonged exposure subjected victims to mercury poisoning, which can evolve into a neurological disorder known as erethism, or the Mad Hatter's disease. It's characterized by personality, physical, and neurological symptoms ranging from low self-confidence, depression, and irritability to delirium, headaches, and uncontrollable shakiness or tremors. It's an exhausting and devastating disorder, and it's sadly way more common than people realize. According to a publication by the American Journal of Industrial Medicine, between 15 to 50% of hatters surveyed in the armpit that is New Jersey showed symptoms of mercury poisoning in 1886, increasing to 60% by 1889 and hitting an apex in 1934 at around 80%. As a double whammy, many of the more ornate hats at the time donned artificial flowers, most of which were dusted with the arsenical Sheila's green. Now, while the dust certainly affected the customers, there's actually very few, if any, reported cases of mercury poisoning resulting from simply wearing the hats. This is because the harmful vapors were either fully baked off in the manufacturing process or essentially sealed within the material, unable to affect the end user. While the adverse health effects of mercury poisoning were well known at the time, it actually wasn't until 1941 that mercury usage was banned in hat manufacturing, and it wasn't even out of medical concern. You see, mercury was a key component in artillery detonators, so the Allies needed all of the mercury they could get to drop some freedom on the Nazis in World War II. As for the UK, however, mercury usage in hat making was never formally banned. It just fell out of favor once safer chemicals like hydrogen peroxide were substituted in around the 1960s. Nice one, gents. Now this one's gonna be short, cause if you are a fine fellette that partakes in the use of false eyelashes to accentuate your eyes, be glad that you weren't around in the Victorian age. Although rare, there is some evidence that suggests a French procedure for sewn-on false lashes. Yeah, no thanks. According to an article by French-sounding yet English publisher Henry Leboucher, a specialist, most likely a wig maker or some other cosmetic expert, would pluck a few healthy hairs from your head and with a very fine needle, pierce the eyelid and thread the hair through in various tight loops of varying length, creating a much greater lash density and thus a more robust look. The problem here is that your eyelids have a lot of nerves in them. That's by design to alert you of any immediate threats to your precious eyeballs. Well, it's a bit of a bummer here because you're going to be feeling each and every prick of the needle as it glides through your skin and pulls the hair through. The healing process, though, was rather quick, if you were lucky. Aseptic technique, the general practice of hygienic medical procedures, was still relatively new and not yet widely adopted, save for specialized invasive surgeries. So hopefully the fellow ramming a needle in and out of your eyelids sterilized it to some degree. Otherwise, you're going to be dealing with a nasty infection. And that's if he's got steady hands. You ever try threading a needle? That shit ain't easy. So consistently catching your lids can prove a challenge in itself, not to mention all while avoiding your very stabbable oculars just a few millimeters away. Now, I have to stress that the only evidence of this procedure comes from 3 articles from the time period, with no documentation as far as formal instruction manuals in medical journals. This suggests that the process was either very rarely performed, or it might be a big fat fib. Hopefully the latter. But we just simply can't ignore the possibility of what some unfortunate fellettes may have endured to make their eyes pop. Yeah, so while editing this, I found out that eyelash transplants are in fact practiced in the modern day. Actually, some of them will use your pubic hair because it's naturally curly. What are we doing? Oh, come on, more eye stuff? Fine. Thankfully, this one doesn't involve direct damage by ways of foreign metal objects. This one was just sheer stupidity. Okay, so you know how in like cartoons and such, characters may do that iconic adorable eye enlarging move that just melts your heart? Well, Victorian women were ahead of the game on that. This is the belladonna plant, more commonly called deadly nightshade. It's extremely toxic if ingested and can even mess you up if you so much as touch it. Severe rashes and blisters are common, and if absorbed through the skin, can cause accelerated heartbeat, headaches, hallucinations, and most notably, dilated pupils. That last symptom, though, actually proved advantageous for emerging ophthalmologists who were examining their patients' eyes. Dilated pupils allow physicians to examine your retinas and optic nerves for any signs of damage or disease. But some women wanted to extend that dilation outside of the physician's office. So there's a reason it's called belladonna. In Italian, it means beautiful woman, so called because it was actually very popular amongst Italian noblewomen throughout the Renaissance, making a comeback a while later during the Victorian age. Simply ignoring all the horrifying side effects, these women only cared about the plant's ability to dilate one's pupils, creating a glassy, alluring gaze that would certainly attract any eligible bachelor with that soulless glare. How could you resist? The star of the drops was atropine, the chemical actually responsible for the dilation. Preparation of the drops was relatively simple. It boiled down to decocting mashed up nightshade fibers to extract the atropine. The diluted mix would then be filtered and sometimes mixed with lemon juice in order to apparently brighten up the eyes, whatever that means. But the dilation of your pupil causes blurry vision. While dilated, your pupils can't expand and contract properly to focus on objects. So these women, while looking like deer in headlights, were essentially functionally equivalent, falling over or bumping into things rather frequently. This could be especially dangerous near moving vehicles or train stations. Not to mention the fact that repeated or heavy use of the stuff increased the likelihood of experiencing those symptoms I mentioned earlier. It was common for users to deal with pounding headaches and suffer from hallucinations as a result of heavy doses. If they kept insisting on looking like a cave goblin, they risked complete blindness or permanent oversensitivity to light. Thankfully though, more reasonable ocular fashion trends like mascara and other makeup came into view in the 1920s, causing belladonna eye drops to evaporate into obscurity. History's most ridiculous riots. Usually when you shout out an N-word in public, it can cause some severe backlash, and things weren't much different over 1,000 years ago. Way back in the humble year of 532 in Constantinople, the capital of the East Roman Empire, now known as the Byzantine Empire, some ancient stuff was about to hit the ancient fan. The number one thing to do in your boring life as a citizen of the Byzantine Empire was to waddle on down to the Hippodrome, the city's main sports arena. There, you could watch men race their little horsey carts against each other in the sport of chariot racing. The sport wasn't just one of entertainment, but one of politics as well. There were 4 teams or factions that you could get behind. You got your Rusata Reds, the Albata Whites, the Veneti Blues, and finally the Prassini Greens. The Reds and the Whites eventually got absorbed into the Greens and Blues and thus began a two-party dispute. The Greens were the team of the lower working class, people like craftsmen, artisans, merchants, or laborers. On the other end of the economic spectrum were the Blues, the uppity rich folk. So the well-to-dos loved the Blues and the limited means favored the Greens, a natural rivalry. Frequently hosting these chariot races was the Emperor himself, and the flavor of the day around this time was Emperor Justinian I, a pretty energetic emperor praised for his various judicial reforms, but also execrated for his harsh taxation policies. Execrated. Here's a new word for you. You see, a few months back, a smaller riot had broken out after one particularly heated chariot race, which really wasn't all that uncommon, to be honest. I mean, look at what happens to cities when sports teams win or lose. Some things never change. Anyway, this particular riot resulted in a few rude dudes getting their noggins knocked. And by noggins knocked, I mean their whole skulls caved in. 2 men were arrested, one green fella and one blue fella. Understandably, they were both charged with murder and sentenced to death. But luck had other plans in store for them. After a freak collapse of the executioner's scaffolding, and thus no other formal way to separate soul from body, the prisoners were instead imprisoned for their crimes, but this didn't really sit too well with the blue and green supporters who wanted the men freed. The lack of mercy really put their tunics in a twist, and they were not quiet about it. Emperor Justinian, who was busy negotiating peace with the Persians, didn't really have time for all of this shit, so as a band-aid solution, he told everyone to take a chill pill and planned to host another, more fantastical chariot race to calm everyone down. But that was a mistake. The worst thing you can tell an angry person to do is to calm down. It rarely works. In January of 532, the day for the chariot race came, and the once divided Greens and Blues now had a common enemy. Since the Emperor was almost always present at events like this, both Blues and Greens would often take it upon themselves to use the time between races to shout political suggestions to the Emperor while they still had his attention. This could be something simple like lowering the cost of goods or demanding the removal of particularly provocative politicians. Well, the topic of trouble in today's turmoil was that of the aforementioned prisoners, both sides united calling for the freedom of the men, but these demands fell on deaf ears, so they yelled louder. The crowd chanted Nika, a phrase translating to the tune of win, victory, or conquer. This was typically shouted by a winning team at the end of a race, but this time it took on a new meaning, and it was directed at the Emperor. But these words would also remain ignored, so the crowd offered 2 more options, fucking A and fucking B. The crowd leapt from the stands and charged towards the palace, attacking the prison holding the 2 men and setting them free before burning it all down. The city spiraled out of control for 7 whole days, with fire and property damage destroying nearly half the capital city. Justinian had conceded to a lot of the rowdy crowd's initial demands, like firing 3 of his top guys, but that didn't stop the destruction. They wanted his head. At the end of his rope, Justinian found himself cornered and was forced into hiding. He continued to cower until his wife, Empress Theodora, calmly offered some kind words of encouragement.
Stop fucking crying!
The Empress had convinced him to stay and face his subjects head on. It was better to die as an emperor than to live life in exile, and he took that advice. Sort of. He requested the rioters gather in the Hippodrome in order to propose an end to the madness. They agreed. But entering the arena wasn't the emperor, it was a general, and a commander, and thousands of soldiers. The gates were slammed shut and secured, starting the rather one-sided negotiation. With one command, the soldiers indiscriminately slaughtered nearly 30,000 unarmed citizens, putting an end to the Nika riot. In the end, Emperor Justinian justified the bloodshed to consolidate power and strengthen his grip on the Byzantine Empire, ruling as one of the greatest emperors of the age. He just had to, make everyone scared to question him. Everyone knows the best combo besides chicken and parmesan is a good old game of sports ball and a medically inadvisable amount of alcohol. Slamming down 1 or 10 beers with your buddies while your favorite teams are all tussling each other. Yeah, that's never ended badly for anyone.
Oh well, just a game.
Well, wouldn't you believe it? It caused quite the ruckus back in 1974. An extremely poorly planned promotion by the Cleveland Indians was 10-cent beer night. A night where, you guessed it, you could buy a usually 65-cent beer for just 10 cents a pop. As expected, this wouldn't be without limits. On paper. You see, each guest could only buy up to 6 beers at a time, but the promotion failed to limit the number of transactions per person, so you and your friends could get completely blasted for just $1 or $2. Now, to be fair, the promotional beer was light, only about 3.2 ABV, but when you're double fisting them things down, the math starts to add up. If that wasn't enough of a catalyst for a rowdy rumble, the Cleveland Indians were facing a rematch against the Texas Rangers after having just lost a few nights prior. Thanks to the 10-cent beer night promotion, attendance was near a record high, over 25,000 patrons, double the usual turnout. The game began and the Rangers quickly took a commanding 5-1 lead, which pissed off the Cleveland fans. You're out. Fuck! The crowd, after slamming down liquid courage for a few innings, started getting bold. The shenanigans began when a fan whipped out his own slugger and dashed across the field. There were a few more cases of relatively harmless indecent exposure, but things soon got out of hand, with Cleveland fans now pelting the other team's players with food scraps and beer bottles, and even some of the more sneaky guests started shooting off firecrackers in the stands and the field. All of these sober folks, realizing that things were about to get nasty, packed up and left before being brought into a brawl. At the bottom of the ninth, Cleveland made a comeback, tying up the game 5-5, but one final disorderly degenerate was about to be the spark of an explosive riot. A 19-year-old fan stormed the field in an attempt to yoink a Ranger player's hat. Not very smart. The fan ended up catching a Spartan kick to the sternum. Now fearing that his own player had been attacked, the Rangers' manager took to the field, bat in hand. Cleveland fans flooded the field and attacked the Rangers, hurling fists, rocks, bottles, chairs, each other, whatever they could get a hold of. Both teams were now fending off all of the fans, but luckily managed to escape the chaos, fleeing within the stadium. But in their absence, the rambunctious rascals destroyed the field, stealing bases and trashing the dugouts.
Well, it looks like I made it to third base one way or another. Right, babe?
The riot lasted just over 20 minutes before police came in and broke it all up, making 9 arrests. All in all, there were no serious injuries and the game was forfeited to the Rangers. Just over 1 month later, a second 10-cent beer night was held to the tune of over 43,000 attendees. But this time, only 2 drinks per person were permitted. No problems occurred. It may have also been due to the fact that there were about 200 cops on site to help maintain order. Back in 1855, the city of Toronto in Ontario, Canada, was really up and coming. Boasting a thriving population of 40,000 syrup sippers, the city had a lot to offer, like 152 taverns, 203 beer shops, and most importantly, dozens and dozens of brothels. Beautiful babes willing to get silly with your willy for the right price. But another form of entertainment was coming to town: the circus. The American SB House Star Troop Menagerie and Circus, to be precise. Acrobats, performers, animals, and of course, the iconic clowns. The show was in town for just 2 nights. After the end of the first night, many of the clowns took the night off from their slapstick comedy to consensually slap their sticks in women's faces at a local brothel. Problem was, they chose the wrong one. This particular establishment was the go-to spot for the local volunteer firefighting brigade. So all night, the men fought for the attention of hardworking women so they could get their dunks sunked. The thing you have to remember is, these were firefighters and clowns of yore, not the type that we see today. For instance, firefighters back in the day were in competition with each other. When there was a fire, they rushed to see who could get there first and get the payout. This often resulted in fire departments banging away at each other while the fire blazed on in the background. In short, these men knew how to fight, and so did the clowns, because the clowns beat up the firefighters so they could get beat off in peace and quiet. 2 firefighters were reported as seriously injured, having to get carted off to be treated for their wounds. But unlike the brothel workers, these firefighters wouldn't be taking this lying down. These clowns were outsiders, and they were about to be reminded of that. The local policemen, firefighters, and many of the town's elite were part of a group called the Orange Order, so they weren't too happy to hear about the showdown with the showman. The very next day, dozens of men from the Order attacked the circus as vengeance. Stones were thrown and fires were ignited, prompting the fire department to show up, only to partake in the carnage. Sorry. After what felt like hours, the mayor finally stepped in to stop the mayhem. The riot stopped, miraculously, with 0 reported deaths. Despite the circus being reduced to cinders, the police did nothing. Why would they? They were in on it. 17 people were reportedly charged, but only 1 ever saw a conviction. The local Torontonians, or whatever they call themselves, didn't really like that response and called out the obvious corruption. To them, they just witnessed a bunch of the local elites destroy a circus unprovoked. The whole fiasco turned public opinion against the Orange Order, and their political power was eventually squeezed from the area. There's fewer things worse in this timeline than the parasites that are scalpers. Scumbags that just buy up and hoard relatively cheap in-demand products only to sell them at a profit once they forced market scarcity. So you're forced to sit back and watch as several sweaty, sad excuses for humans raid your local shelves for every last Pokemon pack while your child realizes that he's not allowed to have a fun hobby. But the concept of scalping itself is far from new. Back in 1766 in the town of Nottingham, England, many merchants were looking to turn some cheese into cheddar. Nottingham was an English economic epicenter thanks to the boom of the Industrial Revolution. Brand new factories meant brand new jobs, and brand new jobs meant that people were flocking to the cities to work. These workers more or less came from agricultural backgrounds, hanging up their plows to work with fancy and deadly machines. Well, with all of these farms shutting down, combined with an overall poor harvest season, the country of England was hurting for food that year. Supply was down, demand was up, so prices for wheats, meats, and treats soon ballooned into unreasonable territory. At the end of each harvest season, Nottingham held their annual Goose Fair in October, a simple city gathering where townsfolk could enjoy a bit of fun while stocking up on food and supplies for the winter. One of the more shelf-stable foods at the time was cheese. Entire wheels could last a family a few months in these colder conditions, but attendees weren't about to shell out all of their shillings on inflated prices. What? Now you might be all, well, yeah, you just said that prices were up because of food shortages, and it's true, they were, but not this bad. Many marketgoers noted that the cheese prices just a town over were roughly half of what was being charged here. So clearly these merchants were being unfair at the fair, but the truth was a lot worse than that. These merchants were buying the cheese in bulk, fresh off of local shipments. So instead of the regular cheese sellers bringing their products to the fair, merchant middlemen bought up all of the supply and resold the curds at marked up prices, pocketing the difference. But this wasn't just limited to Nottingham. The merchants planned to sell those cheeses around the country, cutting off a critical supply of food for the locals. So the people got pissed and began to attack, surrounding all the merchants fronts and backs. They had one demand: sell the cheese here, but the merchants said no with a fuck out of here. And so the riot began. Roads were blocked, merchants were clocked, and carts were knocked over. If they weren't to be sold at a fair price, they would be stolen instead. Rioters began to loot any and all cheese shops, smashing windows and yoinking what wheels they could, throwing them out to the public so everyone could get their fair share. One of the merchants had a literal boatload of cheese and tried to set sail before being boarded. He quickly agreed to rioters' demands to sell the cheese for cheap, but his boat was still looted on principle. The riot got so out of control that a regiment of the British Army had to be called in. They set up shop and fired into the crowd of looters. But of course, instead of hitting any actual looters, William Eggleston, a local farmer just minding his own business, got wanged by a few rogue slugs. The riot lasted for several more days, eventually dying down once the remaining Kurds made their way out of the city. Remember when companies used to host special giveaways, find a golden ticket and win a big old truck, or be the millionth customer and win a lifetime supply of used toenail clippings? They don't really do those anymore. And for good reason. Something that the Pepsi Corporation would find out the hard way in 1992. In order to hook new customers onto their delicious and nutritious sugary soda, Pepsi held a contest in the Philippines. The Pepsi Number Fever Contest. Bottle caps of Mountain Dew, 7-Up, Mirinda, and of course Pepsi would each have a number printed underneath them ranging from 1 to 999. It was up to customers to collect these bottle caps and wait to see what numbers were announced as winners of various prizes. These were either small monetary or free product prizes, but the grand prize was a whopping 1 million Philippine pesos. This equated to about $40,000 in 1992, or about $92,000 in 2025 money. This was, at the time, equivalent to about 51 times the average annual salary in the Philippines, so it was a pretty big deal. Pepsi saw their monthly sales in the area balloon 40% as people scrambled for their chance at wealth. New prizes and winning numbers were announced each night on television and radio, and the people would redeem whatever prizes they won. The entire promotion ran from February into May of '92. By the end of the run, over 51,000 different prizes were awarded, including 17 lucky winners of the grand prize. But unfortunately, everyone's luck was about to run out, or at least to them, it would seem like their luckiest day of their lives. As a side note, when companies hold sweepstakes like this, they set aside a specific budget and plan out how many winners of each prize there will be to spend that budget. For the Pepsi Number Fever contest, it was $2 million. They had already made that back in the first few weeks of the promotion, but once the budget was spent, then the promotion was over. On May 25th, another grand prize winning number was announced, 349. Since this was a grand prize, only 2 bottle caps bearing the winning number were supposed to be in circulation. There were more. A lot more. Thanks to an oopsie in the manufacturing department, over 800,000 bottles were distributed with the number 349 under the cap. So in theory, Pepsi was now on the hook for over $32 billion in prizes, almost triple what the entire Pepsi company was worth at the time. Fleets of Filipino fellas and fellettes flocked to their local Pepsi bottling plants to redeem their fortune, but were confused when they saw everyone else with the same supposed winning number. To make matters worse, the company retracted the number, correcting it to 134 the next morning. All of the top Pepsi executives held an emergency meeting to decide a course of action. They agreed to eat into the promotion's profits and count it as a wash. But for 800,000 people, this meant that they could only forfeit about $18 a person. Nearly 500,000 accepted, but 300,000 did not. Thousands of irate individuals banded together, forming the 349 Alliance with the goal of boycotting Pepsi products and eventually receiving their promised prizes. But that wouldn't happen. Over the next several months, numerous small riots broke out, destroying dozens of Pepsi delivery trucks and endangering Pepsi employees. Unfortunately, an extremist protester lobbed a live grenade in a warehouse, popping 3 bottle plant workers in the process. Another device that was hucked at a Pepsi truck ended up taking the lives of a local school teacher and a 5-year-old girl. Yellow. Legal actions against Pepsi persisted up until 2006, where the Supreme Court ruled in favor of Pepsi, absolving them of any future liability for the contest. The contest was a good idea in theory, but it ended up fizzing out and falling flat. It's pronounced Palingopur, and it's ridiculous. Also known as the Eel Riot, this little event is quite the hidden gem in the history of Amsterdam. Let me introduce you to Palingtrekken, a rather curious Dutch pastime. It involves a bunch of your closest friends, a long rope, and a lubed up live eel. Your imagination filling in the blanks a little bit there? Well, allow me to paint a picture. Freaky deaky Dutch dudes would spend summer afternoons attempting to grab a live eel from a rope draped across either a canal or trees, while standing in boats or on horseback respectively. Pull on the dangling devil and be declared a winner. But if you miss your swing, you'll end up losing more than just your balance. It was a fun Dutch tradition for hundreds of Dutch years, until the Dutch government, being the Dutch oven that it was, laid down the Dutch law. Deemed an act of unnecessary cruelty, the practice was banned in the mid-19th century, but that wouldn't deter the population from yanking their eels in public. One fateful day in July of 1886, a group of young labormen were looking to trekken some paling on the Lindelgracht Canal in the impoverished Amsterdam neighborhood of Jordan. A few local policemen caught the men in the act, being all, absolutely not, but like, in Dutch. One officer sprang into action, cutting the rope across the canal and putting an end to the game. So the laborers put an end to him. The officer was dragged into a nearby cellar and had the ever-loving shit beat out of him. The other officers fled for backup, but this only escalated the situation. Deeming the act of cutting the rope more as an act of oppression rather than punishment, the young men rallied nearly the whole neighborhood, forming a bloodthirsty mob. They fussed about for hours, clashing against police reinforcements, but when nightfall hit, everyone kinda called it a day and went sleepy by. The entire neighborhood awoke the very next morning refreshed, but still fuming, so they armed themselves with sticks and stones to break some bones.
They regrouped and stormed the local police station to vent their frustrations. They began to pelt officers with rocks, sticks, bigger rocks, literal garbage. Whatever they could get their hands on, it became a projectile. Knowing that peace was not an option, the officers called in military support. But even while staring down a well-armed army, the mob would not falter. The army decided to calm the rioters down with some live ammunition. Once the smoke had settled, 26 lay dead with 130 injured. But the eel was okay.
If you've ever experienced the astronomical pain from stepping on a Lego, or the agonizing torment of waiting for a response after sending a risky text to someone you're about to find out has no interest in you, then you've experienced what true torture feels like. But people way back in the day were a little bit more sadistic when it comes to causing extremely unpleasant experiences. In fact, public torture and executions were something to look forward to. Yo, Tom, I hear they're finally about to execute Jack the Jacker. You coming? No, but I bet he is. Anyway, I gotta go catch a movie with my third wife. Maybe next time. Catch a what? So anyway, here's 5 torture methods that you may not be familiar with. If you're not one to handle any kind of violence or blood or stuff like that, why did you even click this video? Well, I hope you're ready, because here we go. First, we have the pena collae, a form of Roman capital punishment which translates to the penalty of the sack. Now, before you get any ideas about someone being a brutal ball buster, this refers to an actual sack. This punishment was handed out to those who were convicted of patricide, the act of offing your own dad. The individual would be bound and placed in a leather sack, but not alone. An assortment of animals included dogs, snakes, chickens, or even monkeys were placed in the sack with you. The sack was then sewn up and tossed into a body of water, so not only did you drown, but you were also getting absolutely demolished by panicking animals who were also going to drown. This punishment must have been quite popular, as it had been used as far back as 100 BC up until the 1700s. The next method of torture showed that the English knew how to party. Designed in the early 1500s, the Scavengton's daughter, or the scavenger's daughter, served the opposite function as the famous rack. Nope, this rack. Instead of stretching the victim to look like a pool noodle, the scavenger's daughter compressed them until the ribs, chest, or spine dislocated. The goal of the device was not death, but simply to interrogate the victims, squeezing the truth as well as a couple organs out of them. The victim would be placed under an iron hoop which was able to be slowly compressed until the victim either confessed or died. It is said that the victims will often have blood shoot out of their ears and nostrils from the intense pressure. There is another device bearing the same name, but it operates under a different principle. The Spanish version, called La Scavenger's Daughter, worked by locking the victims in an excruciating and unnatural position, causing their joints to freeze up. But that can be quickly remedied with a few healthy stretches on the rack. Speaking of stretches, boy is this one a doozy. Take a look at this sucker. This is called the Pear of Anguish. What do you think it does? This bad boy right here, invented sometime around the 1600s, was theorized to also have been used as an extortion device, extracting confessions from victims. Leaving little to the imagination, the device is thought to have been inserted into the mouth, where it would be slowly opened, expanding the pear to the point of unhinging or breaking the jaw. There is also a possibility it may have been used in buttholes and hoo-has. Though, fortunately, there is almost no evidence to support that this device was used in such a way. But to be fair, the Pear of Anguish looks like something you could buy off of Adam and Eve or at the back of a Spencer's. We're gonna move on to something a little less open-y. Ah yes, here we have the Heretic's Fork, a device that looks like someone forgot where they put their wrench. Yet this is another truth extractor. Apparently a lot of people lied back then, unlike today. Used mainly during the highly unexpected Spanish Inquisition by the loving and inclusive Catholic Church to seek out non-believers, the device was affixed between the jaw and the chests of many victims. Both ends of the fork were pronged. One end would pierce under the chin while the other pierced the sternum. The length of the fork was customized for each use, making sure that the victim's head was tilted all the way back full stop. The victim would be unable to speak or sleep without experiencing excruciating pain. Typically, the forks were inscribed with the phrase, "I recant," meaning that the victim was physically unable to recant. If you didn't confess, you were tortured in worse fashions and eventually executed. But if you did confess, you had the pleasure of still being tortured for being a filthy heretic. A real win-win there. The good news is that even though it was used hundreds of years ago, you can still buy one off of Amazon for one low payment of $44.99. So keep your chin up. Okay folks, last one. You having a good time? Yeah, you are. The execution method called Ling Chi has been used for over 1,000 years, which is appropriate because it's also known as the death by 1,000 cuts. Reserved for only the most heinous of crimes, this form of punishment was used in China from the year 900 up to the early 1900s. Generally, the guilty would be restrained on a wooden post with one or multiple executioners cutting into them, usually starting off with small, slow incisions to maximize suffering, and then continuing on to larger and more damaging cuts, sometimes even severing whole limbs toward the end. Unfortunately for the victim, the process was never fully well defined, and that was left up to improvisation. Historical recounts of Ling Chi state that executions could be as quick as 20 minutes or as long as 3 days. Not only was the permanent damage to the human body bad for the victim while they were alive, obviously, but it was also believed that the damage inflicted would carry on into the afterlife, condemning them to be sliced and diced as a spooky spirit. Huge bummer. Well, now you've done it. You fell down a weird witch's wormhole and landed yourself in ancient Egypt. So, can you survive? Let's find out. The first thing you might ask is, which ancient Egypt? Because the entirety of ancient Egypt spanned across several thousands of years with quite a few different eras. Let's go with, the iconic New Kingdom, the height of Egyptian power and influence, and the most documented for research purposes. How convenient. Since you made it to this video, I'm going to assume that you're not a literal mouth-breathing, knuckle-dragging, fragile infant. So you can give yourself a pat on your freshly whipped back, because you've already survived the hardest part, childhood. Being a kid wasn't easy. Since they didn't have any fancy beeping machines to hook moms up to and keep babies alive, infant mortality rates were extremely high. 20 to 50% of babies didn't make it out the womb. If you survived being born, next up was surviving the world. Much harder. With things like disease, hunger, and other environmental factors out to get you, it's not going to be a stroll through Easyville. I mean, some of these kids look so frail you could practically see their blinking health bar. Hang in there, guys. Oh, bummer. Your main duty as a kid is to help out the family that brought you into this world. We're talking chores, taking care of your siblings, protecting the farm, learning the family business, everything necessary for survival. As far as food, it's whatever mama and papa could scrape together, which is mainly bread, milk, fruits, and veggies. Ever have half an onion on dry bread with warm milk? It's actually pretty disgusting, but it's what keeps you growing. Because if you don't eat, well... And hey, if your papa has a high enough fishing level, he could bring home a pretty sweet catfish to tear into. Get that protein. Your mother, assuming she survived slopping you out of her belly, would feed and care for your ungrateful ass. But none of that is applicable since you just got orphaned by the space-time continuum. Before we take a look at what to do next, let's see where you would fit in the grand scheme of society, because everyone has their place. Ancient Egyptian society worked in a hierarchy with rich and powerful guys at the top and everyone else at the not top. So really no change from the modern world. The head honcho around these parts is the pharaoh. He's the divine king and whatever he says, goes. Subscribe. Just under him are his closest bros and advisors. Then we have an educated and skilled middle class, and then a laboring lower class with slaves and servants at the bottom, which were usually foreign prisoners of war. Since there's a 95% chance that you'd stick out like a turd in a punch bowl amongst a well-tanned, weird-talking population, you'd probably be captured and sold into slavery. Tough break, outsider. But let's assume you can convince the xenophobic guards that you're one cool dude. Hey, I'm one cool dude. It worked! Time to get a job. Since you can't speak Wingdings 3, you're gonna have to prove your worth through manual labor. Luckily, there's plenty of job to choose from like farming and... Over 90% of all ancient Egyptians were farmers, so there's plenty of friends and rivals to be made. You know, see who could grow the best onions or whatever it is farmers did for fun, finger each other's cabbages, I don't know. But your absolute best friend is the Nile River, which is your #1 source of delicious brown water for your crops. Just don't taste test it. Thankfully, the application process to work on a farm is no more than moving a rock from here to there. And with your stellar gamer build, you can easily get the job done. Just remember to lift entirely with your back. As a bonus, you can read and write, not in hieroglyphics, but in cooler things like letters and numbers, perfect for taking your own notes. You're hired. Now you can get to work and earn that bread. But since the Persians haven't invaded yet and introduced proper currency, you'll be working for literal bread.
So you slave away for months on Bahir's family wheat farm, eating your brown bread and sandy beer dinners while sleeping on a filthy, crusty, dusty dirt floor. Watch out for snakes, they bite. Day in and day out, you swing your sickles and your hoes, dreaming about the hoes you left behind, taking extra caution not to get too distracted. Looks like you cut off Bahir's arm. Bahir will remember that. It's then you look down and notice some squishing between your toesies. The ground's getting rather moist. The Nile's flooding, you say to no one. After you finish fighting off the invading river rats using your +7 strength copper sword, it's time to pause the farming grind and try your hand at construction while the Nile does its thing. Oh look, the pharaoh wants you to help build a new pyramid. Lucky you. Since you have countless hours placing virtual cobblestone under your belt, this sounds like a pretty sweet gig. Just keep an eye out, because sometimes it's not yourself that you need to watch out for. Daily labor is just part of your worry though, because you still have diseases like slaves are the hot and trending collectible at the time. You could even trade them to your friends if you're feeling generous enough. I got trachoma. Well, I've got first edition smallpox, check it out. With your 21st century wrinkle brain, you know that you need to keep clean to prevent disease, so you take a dip in the Nile to wash your many crevices. Just downstream of the laundry, which is downstream of the town's dumping grounds. Uh-oh, looks like you picked up a friend. A parasitic flatworm went and crawled up your roundworm, and now you have schistosomiasis. With that comes a fever and aggressive diarrhea. And since we're in ancient times, you know what that means. But little wriggling worms aren't the only threats you face. Like the infected fellas a minute back found out, there were many different diseases sickening up the land. The most popular being tuberculosis, smallpox, and malaria. These guys would make sure that your stay in ancient Egypt would be a quick one, so be sure to swat some skeeters and tell your neighbors to cover their coughs for Ra's sake. Oh, sorry, I thought that there was a mosquito on you. Yeah, you too. Anyway, you get back to chiseling some sandstone blocks and, looks like you caught Pharaoh checking out the goods. He admires your strong physique, attention to hygiene, and glistening back sweat. He even heard about your conquering of the river rats, and he's impressed. Those are some good qualities. Good qualities for a soldier. You just got bumped up a few societal ranks, look at you go. Oh, Pharaoh wants to expand his empire. Well, now your promotion makes sense. Time to go to war. Being a soldier can't be too hard, right? You just pick up a shield and a sword and swing it a little. After all, people are just bigger rats. Oh sweet, they even have the cool curved swords.
Curved swords.
It's called a khopesh, and boy does it hurt. But if swinging a sword ain't your style, you could opt for something a little less slashy and a little bit more stabby. If you want to poke someone further away but still want to be close enough to revel in their death, I recommend a spear or javelin. If you really have the urge to stab someone at least a few thousand scarabs away, go for the simple and sweet bow and arrow. It never fails. Unless you miss. Alright, time to step onto the sandy battlefield and fight for a country you just fell into. The enemies of the day are the Sea Peoples. No one really knows who they were, and they most likely came from somewhere north of the Mediterranean. But Pharaoh don't give a good gosh dang. They've been flaunting their stupid looking boats and shit for the last time. Fuck you, Egypt! Oh, it's so on. Now, the first thing you're gonna wanna do is... damn. Alright, let's try that again, respawn. Okay, quick time dodge the arrow, fire your own. Ooh, nice shot. Good arc, stable flight, and... right on target. Good job murdering that guy with absolutely no complex backstory or family that he was fighting to protect from invaders. To him, you were the bad guy, but hey, war is hell, isn't it? You keep popping off shots and taking out numerous expendable enemy NPCs. While you continue to just riddle the battlefield with arrows, you notice something in your peripheral. Not something, someone. Oh, hey Bahir, didn't know you were a soldier. Thank God, it was just a dream.
Unluckiest deaths in history. Ever read about the unusually tragic death of some historical figure, or even just the random old lady across the street and think, oh, that sucks? Well, you're in for a few more of those. Starting off this list is Francois Vatel, one heck of a perfectionist. He was the maître d'hôtel, or maître d', for French nobility.
In case you didn't know, a maitre d' is the master of the house, basically a general in terms of waitstaff at a restaurant or overall event. They make sure that everything is in line from decorations to food and that all guests are always happy. Now, if you've ever worked in any form of customer service, you know how stressful this can be, especially when you can't tell your guests to frig off because they're literal royalty. Unlike customers today who just think they are. Francois was in a career of pure stress, but he was the best at what he did, having been formally recognized by many top chefs across France for his ability to ensure guest satisfaction. I mean, how often do you hear stories about royal servants? Almost never, except for Francois. History often mistakes Francois for being a chef himself, but that was never the case. He just handled everything in the front of house. Anyway, this story begins and ends all the way back in 1671 in Fancy Pants, France. It was at this time that France was experiencing a golden age under Supreme French King Overlord Leader fella Louis XIV, France's and history's longest known reigning monarch to date. This big bushel of baguettes ruled for almost 72 and a half years. Under his rule, French power expanded across the world, arts and culture were flourishing, and the wealthy were living in utmost extravagance. Sure, there were plenty of wars going on in the background, but that's for the poor people to worry about. With such mindless self-indulgence pouring out of every orifice, parties, galas, celebrations, shindigs, and balls were just the norm. But these royal retreats demanded a professional to ensure that everyone kept a crusty yellow smile on their dusty white faces. That's where Francois came in. Having a strong resume of serving under notable French figures you've probably never heard of, like this guy and that guy, Francois was given the task of organizing a banquet in King Louis's honor for over 3,000 people. That's 3,000 of the most rich and powerful people of the age. You don't want to disappoint them, do you? You can't. It's not an option. Do you know what they would do to someone who messed up the king's banquet? Well, that option wouldn't be invented for another 100 years, but it's a quick end no matter how you cut it. The feast was to last across 3 days, and Francois was given just 2 weeks to prepare. So with no time to waste, he nervously took to the task. Over the next 15 days, Francois managed to get all of his French ducks in a row. Drapes were draped, silverware sparkled, chandeliers shimmered, and guests were gobsmacked. All 6,000 of them. Yeah, over double the anticipated party size showed up. Luckily, there was still plenty of food to spare. But another kick in the dick for Francois was the fact that it was raining, canceling the planned fireworks for the evening, which bummed out several of the guests. Well, that's just uncontrollable circumstances, you might say, as you pull out your brown tooth. But not to Francois. Remember, he was a perfectionist, and things were not perfect. Besides these 2 minor infractions, the first day went off without a hitch, but the second day would prove to be Francois' last. In the morning, Vitel received devastating news. Only half of his fish order for the breakfast buffet had arrived. He knew that without the precious poisson, people would be palpably peckish. This was the last straw. Francois spiraled into a panic, knowing that he had failed in his duties and he would forever feel the crushing weight of his shame for the rest of his life. But the rest of his life wouldn't actually be that long, as shortly after receiving the news and breaking down into an inconsolable mess, Francois rushed into his bedchambers to right his wrong the only way he knew how. Standing by his bedside, he brandished his iconic ceremonial stabbing sword and rammed it through his own tummy. He laid in a puddle of his own blood, undiscovered for some time until, "Yo, Francois, the rest of the fish is here." Yeah, that's right. The remainder of the order arrived almost immediately after Francois decided to carry out a permanent solution to a temporary problem. His body was then taken from the palace and buried in secret while the rest of the guests partied on. Nearly every aspect of Isadora Duncan's life could be summarized by one word: tragic. Childhood? Tragic. Adult life? Tragic. Family? Tragic. Career? Successful and groundbreaking, but then tragic. All of this capped off by her sudden, unlucky, and tragic death. Born and raised in the sparkling cesspit that is San Francisco, California in the 1800s, things were already not off to a great start. She was the youngest of 4, with a loving mother and supportive and wealthy banker father, until his bank collapsed under mysterious and fraudulent circumstances, subsequently leading to a marital collapse under mysterious and infidelitous circumstances. He then died in a boat crash several years after that. It is said that his last words were somewhere in the ballpark of,
So after Papa's bank went rupt and her parents defaulted on their marriage, the struggles really stacked up. She lived with her mother and siblings, moving to Oakland, California to begin life anew. She attended school from ages 6 to 10, but dropped out, finding the schooling system restrictive, boring, and lame. Instead, Isadora and her siblings earned their daily bread by teaching the local yokels the art of dance. Thankfully, years of doing the hokey pokey allowed Isadora to turn herself around. After all, that's what it was all about. She joined a formal theater company at the age of 19 to expand her art. Problem was, the extent of dance at the time was very rigid and emotionless. Instead, Isadora yearned for something a little bit more free-flowing and expressive. She wanted less of this, and a little bit more of this. But the dance community in America wasn't ready to pick up what she was throwing down, so she had to search for better opportunities abroad. Well, that was definitely a good choice because she soon found herself dancing in the presence of wealth and royalty across London.
Oh, it's a beautiful dancer, isn't it?
And Paris.
I'm le deux fromage.
Her revolutionary style took the world of dance by storm. With her newfound success, she wished to provide better opportunities for the youth, opportunities that she wished that she had as a spry sapling. In order to do so, she opened up an informal dance school in Berlin, Germany in 1904, which, along with teaching kids their ABCs and Eins, Zwei, Dreis, also put interpretive dance on the menu, not as a profession, but as a hobby and method of expression. After about a decade, Isadora left to open up a second school in Paris after a certain Austria started getting hungry for conflict. Unfortunately, the new school didn't last very long as tensions escalated and the Great War broke out in Europe, so she fled back home to the US right when the getting was good. As for her personal life, her travels introduced her to many suitable bachelors across the art world. She found love multiple times, and Cupid shuffled into the sheets, popping out 3 kids. But of course, fate would have other plans for this happy chapter. For instance, one of her children died in infancy. The other 2 cruised along in a car with their caretaker and crashed into the River Seine. They drowned. Understandably, Isadora spiraled into a deep, deep depression in her later years and fell out of the spotlight, her debts piling up as high as her empty liquor bottles. But this life of misfortune was about to be topped off with a disastrous bow. On September 14th, 1927 in Nice, France, Isadora was riding shotgun in a fancy car while wearing an abnormally long fancy scarf. Normally, the combination of heavy machinery and loose articles of clothing warrant a live leak watermark, and poor Isadora was about to learn why. As the vehicle sped off and she bid her farewells, her fashionable fabric forged her fate. Her long scarf that was whipping in the wind became entangled in the rear tire of the car, wrapping around the rear axle and pulling tight. In an instant, the scarf became a noose, and Isadora's neck was snapped before she could even react. At just 50 years old, the spotlight faded on the inspirational dancer. Now trust me, for the life of me, I really want to pronounce this guy's name as Tycho Brahe, but apparently the proper Danish pronunciation is Tycho Brahe. Like, listen to this.
Tycho Brahe, Tycho Brahe, Tycho Brahe.
Person saying this doesn't even sound confident in their own pronunciation. Anyway, teeny tiny Tycho was the talk of the town back in the 16th century. He was renowned as one of the world's greatest astronomers and one of the last great astronomers before the invention of the telescope. So these guys were just raw dogging the heavens trying to figure it all out. Hey, is that a new star up there? Oh, where? Right over... Oh, nope. I lost it. But that of course didn't discourage the celestial sillybillies from trying to figure out how the known universe worked, or at least what the human eye could see. Born and heir to many of the Kingdom of Denmark's noble families, Tycho was loaded, and thus well-educated. He made several breakthroughs in the field of astronomy and even dabbled in astrology and alchemy, but we know those are more pseudoscience poppycock. Well, unless you're a middle-aged woman who thinks that jerking a crystal with rainwater will make all of your wishes come true or whatever.
A new hand touches the beacon.
Despite his innovations of spotting new stars and measuring the skies with rather impressive accuracy, he still made the oopsie of proposing his own geocentric model, which put the Earth in the center of the universe rather than the Sun. The planets revolved around the Sun, but the Sun revolved around the Earth. He almost had it. Don't worry though, Copernicus took home the blue ribbon with his heliocentric model.
The thing about newer branches of science is that there's a lot to discover as you put the fundamental pieces together, which grants you a lot of leverage over outsiders looking in who just don't understand it quite yet. That being the case, many higher nobles and even the king himself applauded Tycho and his efforts, just stuffing his pockets with money to fund any and all research that he desired to advance the field of astronomy. What's that? You've charted over 700 stars? Beautiful. There's things called supernovas? Fantastic. Comets are just burning bits of rock? Amazing. Can you leave? Danish King Frederick II was so tickled by Tycho's work that he granted him an estate on an island to build his own personal, customized observatory so that he could look up at the sky in complete solidarity. And so he did. For about 21 years, Tycho plotted the planets, tracked the transits, and crunched the calculations. Everything seemed great. At least until King Frederick bit the disease dust and his 11-year-old war-obsessed, noble-hating son took over and threatened to seize Tycho's land and assets. Not wanting to deal with this two-body problem, the astronomer said screw it and shifted his orbit over to Prague, where he was invited to build another observatory. This time, however, he took on an apprentice, one Johannes Kepler, who would go on to influence many famed physicists like Galileo and Sir Isaac Newton. Together, the two continued where Tycho left off before getting booted from his Tower of Solitude. But everything came to a halt in 1601 when attending a banquet. According to Kepler, Tycho was in agonizing discomfort. You alright? Nope, gotta piss. Real bad. Dude, just get up and go. Nope, bad manners. Gotta hold it. Alright, don't complain to me when, you piss yourself. Ooh, lordy. Yo, Tycho. Tycho eventually headed home to drain his dragon, but at that point, it would barely even dribble. Over the next several days, the pain got excruciatingly worse, and there was no relief in sight. Just 11 days after holding in his pee to avoid bad etiquette at dinner, Tycho Brahe died of a completely avoidable bladder infection. Remember, fellas and fellettes, listen to what your body's telling you, otherwise, you might just piss it off. For poor Cornelia Zangaribandi, little is really known about her life, as the only remarkable thing about the wrinkly Diovelina was her mysterious, sudden, and fiery fate. That's because Cornelia is one of the unlucky few cases of a phenomenon known as spontaneous human combustion. A cause of death in which the victim suddenly bursts into flames seemingly unprovoked or without an obvious cause and is reduced to nothing but a pile of ash. But when you really dig deep into the dirt of these cases, you start to recognize some patterns. For one, the victims are almost always alcoholics to some degree and recently horked down a medically inadvisable amount of booze. That's the spirit, and that's the wine. Next, the victims tend to be elderly females. Not that it necessarily makes much of a difference, but combustible Cornelia here was 66 years young when she attempted to cosplay as a phoenix. Additionally, there was always an external source of ignition, which, in my opinion, completely invalidates the whole spontaneous aspect. So what did the heck happen to Tua Cornelia? Well, on one fateful night in 1731, the Italian noblewoman had just finished off a non-stereotypical meal. Countess Cornelia was reported by her maid as acting rather, quote, dull and heavy, slomping around to and fro after downing a hefty heap of brandy. The maid helped the inebriated elder to her room, and the two spent several hours chit-chatting and shooting the shit. The countess was also a creature of habit, habitually applying some of her own personal ointment across her withering frame, an icky-sticky camphorated brandy mix which helped with her pain relief. After some bobbitying and a bit of boopying, the maid left the countess's room after she boarded the train to Sleepytime Junction. And so, all was well. Until the next morning. Cornelia was noted to be sleeping in a bit later than usual, but that was to be expected after how heavily she drank the night before. The maid eventually entered the countess's chambers to find something horrifyingly perplexing. According to the eyewitness, this is what she found. 4 feet distance from the bed was a heap of ashes, 2 legs untouched from the foot to the knee with their stockings on. Between them was the lady's head, whose brains, half of the back part of the skull, and the whole chin were burnt to ashes, amongst which were found 3 fingers blackened. All the rest was ashes. A small oil lamp on the floor was covered with ashes, but no oil in it. The countess was dead. The curious part is that no other pieces of furniture in the room seemed to be affected by the suspected blaze. Instead, everything was draped in a greasy, smelly soot. Now, it may have appeared as a mysterious death to the people of the time, but us modern folk live in an age of true crime podcasts and such, so it's pretty easy to piece together what probably happened. Nevertheless, it's a pretty tragic way to go, but probably a good reminder to never handle open flames after converting your body into a human Molotov cocktail. The Mughal Empire was one of the richest and longest ruling empires in the history of India, but it was almost lost in its infancy. Inheriting the newly founded empire in 1530 from his dad at the age of 22, Emperor Humayun bit off way more than he could chew. He was an inexperienced ruler and lacked a lot of the self-confidence and leadership qualities that you'd expect from an emperor. But he was the eldest son, so it all went to him. Gotta love primogeniture. That, my good fellas and fellettes, is the word of the day. Now, with it being a new empire and all, there was a problem with consolidating power. Lots of the local governors and leaders resisted Mughal control. To help disperse some of that responsibility, Humayun granted some land to his 3 younger half-brothers, all of whom were little shitheads, constantly undermining their older brother to the point of collapsing the empire as a whole. Not far off, another ruler had taken notice of the young emperor's power struggle. This guy was Sher Shah Suri of Bihar, and he saw quite the opportunity in front of him. Not wanting to waste any time, he quickly gathered his army and made a push for Agra, the capital of the Mughal Empire, and one sheep's onomatopoeia away from being a Disney IP. Humayun retaliated, and the two clashed on the battlefield. After a few skirmishes, the two agreed to a diplomatic end to the fighting. Sher Shah was given control over some territory in exchange for a peaceful retreat. He agreed, but since the deal did not explicitly state no takesy-backsies, the conniving little devil immediately reneged on the agreement and slaughtered the Mughal army, with Humayun barely escaping across the Ganges. The retreating emperor pleaded with his 3 brothers for support, but they were too busy negotiating with Sher Shah over what land they would receive after their brother's demise. I told you they were shitheads. Unfortunately, Humayun did lose his empire in 1540 and was exiled to Persia for 15 years. But while in Persia, he was able to use some charisma to persuade the Safavid emperor to provide some military support so he could go back and kick the Shah's shit in, which is what happened. The Mughal Empire was restored in 1555 and all was right again. That is, until about a year later in 1556, where Humayun met a rather silly demise. When leaving his library with a handful of books, the emperor had to walk down a bunch of stone steps. Since OSHA training wasn't yet mandatory or invented, Humayun was unaware of the dangerous predicament he had put himself in. After hearing the call for daily prayer, his own muscle memory took over and he knelt down to acknowledge that call, as he did on a regular basis. But this time, he tripped, slipped, and tumbled down the entire stone stairwell, bashing his melon open on a stone corner. The poor guy died 3 days later of his injuries. But at least the Mughal Empire reigned for another 300 years, so that's a positive.
Embarrassing royal deaths. This is Louis III, and this is his dad, Louis II, King of West Francia, also known as the Kingdom of the Franks. Hey Frank. Hey Frank. Louis II here is renowned for being a very peaceful and very loving ruler for his very short 2-year reign between the years of 877 and 879. And now, he's dead, which is even more peaceful. Now, Louis III is the king-to-be at the ripe old age of 16. But since his parents married in secret before he was slopped out, his claim to the throne is being questioned. Now, in order to keep things civil, Louis had struck a deal with his younger brother to rule together. And with that agreement, West Francia was split in 2. Okay, this is my half, and there's yours. Fine by me. My side has the Xbox. Louis III got the north, and his brother, Carloman II, got the south. Together, the two brothers fought off any would-be usurpers from East Francia who contested their reign. Battles were fought for over a year with some back and forth, but ultimately ended in a loss, and a portion of their kingdom was ceded to the east. But while East Francia celebrated its victory, a distant threat loomed over the horizon. Those dang Vikings were showing up in 881 and began to pillage the village and plunder asunder. However, East Francia, still riding their high, managed to kick the Vikings shit in. Not wanting to sail their ships home in shame, the Vikings instead tried their luck with West Francia. Bad move. They would soon learn that 2 kings were better than Vikings. Louis and Carloman went on the offensive and took the invaders by surprise. Together, the brother armies slaughtered the Vikings, cutting down around 9,000 men in the clash.
This victory was absolutely huge for the two young monarchs, who were praised by both Western and Eastern Frankish kingdoms. Now keep in mind that both kings were teenagers, so the ego trip was insane. That being the case, Louis took to finding himself a queen, as to produce an heir and to cement his legacy. Louis decided to pursue love in 882 and ended up quite literally pursuing a potential partner. In a bout of hopefully consensual horseplay, the young maiden fled from the eager monarch on horseback to her father's house.
Why are you running?
Louis, very calmly hunting down his love interest, ended up completely conking his dome on the top of a low doorway. That's certainly one way to get head. And since he had yet to sow his seed, his younger brother was left to rule on his own. Well, he died 2 years later after being accidentally stabbed by his servant during a hunting trip. Bummer. Little Basil I was quite the inspirational success story. Born into a dirt-poor Armenian family in the Byzantine province of Macedonia way back in 811, baby Basil had quite the social ladder to climb. But such a challenge was deemed necessary as he was determined to dodge his destitute destiny. Too bad that he and his family were captured by Bulgarians when he was just 2. Luckily, Basil was able to escape his captors. It just took 23 years. He sought to live out his newfound freedom and fled to Constantinople, which is not yet Istanbul. Possessing incredible strength and an uncanny ability to roll 20s on any and all charisma checks, Basil made leaps and bounds up that social ladder. He began working as a lowly stable boy, got promoted to servant under a relative of the emperor, met a wealthy cougar noblewoman who just threw money at him, dabbled in sweaty, slippery wrestling, and then took on a gig as a bodyguard for Supreme Empire King Emperor guy Michael III. Now, you'd figure that being a bodyguard to the emperor would be a great place to coast until retirement, but Basil was just getting started. He managed to gain the utmost trust of the emperor, even being formally adopted as a son. And taking advantage of this, Emperor Mikey had been convinced by Basil that his own uncle was secretly plotting to take the throne, so he gave Basil permission to address the issue. He did. This false act of loyalty resulted in the emperor crowning Basil as co-emperor, which was not his best move. You see, Emperor Michael III wasn't very good in his decision making, which is probably why the public didn't favor him all that much. Basil had one last obstacle in the way of the crown: his newly adoptive dad. But that's nothing a quick swipe of a sword can't fix. Basil dropped the "co" in his title and was now the full-fledged emperor of the Byzantine Empire in 867. Despite having 0 qualifications for the job, Basil's establishment of the Macedonian dynasty brought the Byzantine Empire into a golden age, with various military victories, large-scale construction, and significant cultural and legal reforms. Problem is, when you get into power through murder, you're always going to be looking over your shoulder for the next person trying to do the same thing to you. Now, I'm not going to question the logistics of it, but during a routine hunting trip in 886, the now elderly Basil managed to get his belt stuck in a deer's antlers. Yeah, I don't know. The animal went wild, as animals tend to do, dragging Basil across the Windows XP default landscape for 16 whole miles. That's at least 2 kilometers. A servant had managed to cut the emperor free, but the damage was done. Although somehow still alive, the emperor sustained tremendous injury. The servant, still brandishing his iconic belt-cutting knife, was accused of attempted murder and was sentenced to death. Wait, what? Emperor Basil I died a bit later from his infected wounds. Old Edmund Ironside was King of England for a whole 7 months in 1016 after his rad dad Athelred II died under unknown circumstances. Poor Edmund rose to power at a pretty bad time. Those gosh damn Vikings were gaining a foothold in England, and they needed a stern talking to at the very least. Not just any Vikings though, these were Danish Vikings, which were much more formidable, flaky, and flavorful. The 26-year-old king fought back hard against the Viking invaders, throwing whatever English forces he could at them, and saw quite a few victories, granting the king the nickname Ironside for his resilience. But even though he won a few battles, he had yet to win the war. The final conflict, the Battle of Essendon, near modern-day Essex, ended in Danish victory, where there was much rejoicing and many crumbs. Following this English loss, a treaty was signed by King Edmund and Viking King Canute. Canute, being a real Canunt, agreed to allow Edmund to continue his reign, but only with the control of Wessex, the heart of Anglo-Saxon England. All English land north of the River Thames was now under Danish control. Now, there was a special stipulation that stated whichever king died first, the other shall inherit the whole country. That sounds like great motivation for assassination plots. Lo and behold, just 1 month later in October of 1016, Edmund Ironside met with a terrible fate. While sitting on his second most important throne, an assailant was assigned to assassinate the king's ass. Yep, old Ironsides caught a blade between his cheeks when he was at his most vulnerable. According to some historical sources, an assassin hid under the king's private turlet, waiting for the perfect opportunity to strike. Edmund, as planned, died of his wounds, granting King Canute full control over England, which he ruled for 2 decades. Being the youngest son of 4 to William the Conqueror, Henry I didn't even have a chance at becoming a Burger King, let alone any kind of respected monarch. When Daddy William logged off the server in 1087, the late king's possessions were divided as such. His eldest son, Robert, inherited Normandy and was made duke. His second son, Richard, got nothing. He was dead, from a hunting accident no less. His third and favorite son, William, inherited the crown of England and was begrudgingly promoted to King William II overnight. I say begrudgingly because it is believed that William II would have preferred to inherit Normandy. Oh well. Finally, little Henry was given lots of money and a tiny bit of English countryside. But that was immediately yoinked by his now king brother, which never caused any internal resentment in the coming years. Now, some historians believe that King William 2.0 didn't care much for his new majestic role, and as a means of escape from his kingly duties, he frequently went on hunting trips. You can probably see where this is going. During one of these trips, William, who wasn't much of an adventurer, took an arrow in the chest. Now, since lungs aren't where arrows are usually stored, William quivered in pain as the arrow knocked the wind out of him, and he drew his last breath shortly after. Yeah, hunting trips are lethal to nobility. Of course, some historical speculations suggest that the friendly fire may not have been so friendly. It is possible that the fiasco was a plot concocted by Henry to seize the crown. After hearing of his older brother's demise through his own earholes, Henry speed ran to the royal treasury and no-clipped to the crown to claim the throne for himself, which certainly didn't help dispel the rumors of foul play. Now, the public wasn't exactly against what had happened, as King William II was a bit of a dick. As the new head honcho, King Henry I immediately began a rollback on many of his late brother's brutal policies, replacing them with much more successful judicial and financial reforms. Being the most educated of the 4 brothers, Henry peacefully ruled England and progressed the kingdom during his reign. Sure, he also invaded Normandy and held his last brother prisoner for life, but that's beside the point. Henry eventually married a Scottish princess and had himself 2 legitimate children that he loved very much, and dozens of illegitimate little crotch goblins whom he didn't.
Daddy, I want a popsicle.
Now, of course, there has to be a little bit of conflict sprinkled in, so his son and only heir got caught up in the White Ship disaster of 1120, which was a titanic tragedy. The titular White Ship, a vessel transporting around 300 people, including many nobles, struck a big old boulder and sank in the English Channel. Only 1 soul survived, but it wasn't the prince, so who cares? This sent Henry into a depressive spiral, as many of his subjects refused to recognize his daughter as a rightful heir to the crown. A woman ruling? Ugh, gross, said the English. In his sad state, Henry cheered himself up the only way a king knows how, with a good old-fashioned hunting trip. But on this trip, Henry gorged himself on lamprey. You know, those weird little wiggly sucking teeth fish? Yeah, apparently those were a delicacy. Despite numerous warnings from his physician to cut it out, Henry continued to chew through the little suckers like candy. Your Majesty, that's a bit much, isn't it? King Henry I contracted food poisoning and died from the illness a week later in 1135 at the age of 66, bringing an end to the Norman dynasty. King Charles II was an asshole, which is why history remembers him as Charles the Bad. Having been born and raised in France and descending from a line of French rulers, Charles felt destined to be the big baguette in charge one day, and when his mother, who was the only daughter of former King Louis X of France, faded from existence, Charles received his inheritance, the paltry kingdom of Navarre, a pathetic spit of land in northern modern-day Spain. This sad excuse for a kingdom was an insult to his name, an insult he would never forget. Although now a king at the age of 17, Charles continued to spend his time in France, hoping to build enough influence to gain recognition for his claim to the crown. but he wasn't successful. He would spend the next several decades double-crossing, manipulating, and backstabbing his way through life, pitting England and France against each other during the 100 Years' War. He had deceived, murdered, and betrayed for the sake of gaining power. He eventually helped spark a revolution in France. No, not the French Revolution. That's not for a while. This uprising was the Jacquerie, a peasant rebellion in 1358 against French nobles. Charles led a suppressive force against the peasants to appear to be the savior of France, but everyone saw right through the ruse. After that publicity stunt, Charles lost almost all political support in France and had to turn to England for help. He ended up pleading with English King Dude Guy Edward III to invade the weakened France and divide the spoils between them, but King Edward was all, no. The king had zero trust for Charles and refused the offer, eventually making peace with France. For now. A few years later, Charles was back on his bullshit, throwing himself in wars and declaring loyalty to both sides in exchange for gaining land and power. He would just favor whichever side was winning. He did get involved in the Spanish Wars between 1365 and 1368, but faked his own kidnapping in order to avoid participating in battle. And that stunt was instantly recognized as cowardice, making Charles a laughingstock of Western Europe. Finally, in 1378, the annoying little fly that was Charlie II was finally swatted. His tiny kingdom was invaded by Spanish forces and promptly wiped out. Charles sought refuge in France and was forced to surrender in shame. Although he retained his crown, he had no power whatsoever. 9 years later in 1387, Charles the Bad fell ill and was pretty much immobile. His doctor prescribed that his body be wrapped in alcohol-soaked linen sheets, and these sheets were sewn around his body each night to promote any healing. Well, one night when finishing up her king sewing duties, a maid had no scissors to cut the last thread of the linen. There were no blades to be found that could finish the job. So, what do you think she did? Time's up. The correct answer was B. In a moment of completely terrible judgment, the young maid resorted to using an open flame candle to melt the thread off. Charles II, who wanted to be a French king so bad, was promptly flambéed in his bed as the maid panicked and fled. Henry II of France was a decent king between the years of 1547 up until his death in 1559. Nothing spectacular, but decent. He's remembered as an advocate for keeping the Catholic faith in France and suppressing them smelly Protestants. He had quite a few either burned at the stake for heresy or had their tongues cut out so they couldn't talk trash about Catholicism. Perhaps his bigger claim to fame, though, was his participation in ending the Italian Wars, which waged across 65 years. With the signing of the Treaty of Cato Cambyses, the deadly wars were finally at an end, and there was much rejoicing. One particular event of celebration was conducted by our subject, King Henry II. To commemorate the end of the wars, as well as his daughter's marriage to King Philip II of Spain, Henry held a jousting tournament. You know, that silly medieval sport where two men hold long wooden poles on horseback and just charge at each other trying to knock the other off? Yeah, I don't get it either, but hey, it's way more entertaining than baseball. Anyway, King Henry II held the tournament on June 30th, 1559 and took it upon himself to participate as a challenger. Perhaps the last bad decision of his life. Set against his own captain of the King's Guard, the two set off to consensually jab their long sticks into each other. With the ASMR pleasures of a wooden crunch, the captain's lance hit its target and shattered upon impact, as they're designed to do. Problem was, some of the splintered wood decided to nuzzle itself right into the king's eyeball for warmth. Oh my god, okay, I'm sorry, you're fine, you're okay. Royal surgeons raced to the king's aid, but were unable to treat the wound. He's gonna be okay, right, Doc?
Tough to say. Problem seems to be this big old piece of wood here. I highly recommend he rest up for a few days and we'll see what happens.
Are you gonna remove the wood?
I'm sorry, I was unaware that you were the royal surgeon. The medics failed to properly treat the king's wounds, which only got worse over the next few days, leading to severe infection. I may have been wrong. King Henry II splintered off from this world on June 10th, 1559. Evil human experiments, again. What's up, you desensitized degenerates? Here's something to really wiggle your teeth at. Back in the 1930s in Sweden, candy was becoming all the rage amongst kids and adults alike. Children couldn't wait to tongue punch their circular sweets day in and day out. Coincidentally, there was also a surge in dental complications such as cavities and tooth rot. Studies showed that roughly 83% of children's teeth
had cavities, which, believe it or not, wasn't exactly unusual, as dental care was complete garbage. So the Swedish government decided it was time to get more enamored with enamel. Of course, right off the bat, the first to be blamed were the candy companies, but they were all, nah, that couldn't be us. Right, guys?
No, I don't think so.
There's really no data to back that up. I don't think so. Sure about that.
I mean, it might be.
In reality, there just wasn't enough scientific evidence to put the blame on anyone in particular. So in order to bridge that little gap of knowledge, the medical board decided to commission the Victorian study, which sought to determine a relationship between tooth decay and sugar-heavy diets. All they needed were some volunteers. But if some government drone came up to you all, hey, feel like munching on these bad boys until your teeth go gray? Unless you're an actual child with some backups pre-programmed into your skull, you'll probably say, yeah, no, and walk away. That guy asking me if I want to willingly rot my teeth. What an idiot. What's a committee got to do to get some willing test subjects? Easy. Simply just... There we go. In 1945, with funding from both the Swedish government and the candy companies, the medical board began performing government-sanctioned trials on patients in the Victorian institution outside of Lund, Sweden. The establishment just so happened to house patients with severe intellectual and developmental disabilities, so in the medical board's eyes, perfect cannon fodder for the study. Between 1945 and 1947, 660 patients were given vitamins and fluoride tablets in conjunction with a low-starch meal and no snacking. After the 2-year period, 73% of these patients had not developed any additional cavities or decay. Alright, so vitamins and fluoride are completely ruled out. Well, in 1947, the medical board swapped the vitamins and fluoride with sugar-heavy diets, which included sugary snacks, drinks, and a specially formulated tacky toffee designed to aggressively stick to teeth. By the end of the study in 1949, about 10% of patients had irreversible damage to their teeth. They were pretty much rotten to the root, being deeply pitted with cavities which caused agonizing pain day in and day out. If you've ever had a toothache, you know how much that sucks. Well, with these results showing a clear link between sugar and tooth decay, the candy overlords weren't exactly pleased, so the scumbags decided to actually withhold the results, publishing them 4 years after the experiment had concluded, resulting in public outcry. Now, of course, people were more pissed at the results rather than the method, which was just brushed off as a necessary evil since the research ultimately did very much benefit society as a whole. Back then, the severely intellectually disabled were seen as merely subhuman, with their forced participation being considered their payment to the society that took responsibility for them. It wouldn't be until the 1990s that the ethics of the study were even questioned. Really messed up. So, remember to brush your teeth. Oh, the monster study. Not a study about a monster, but arguably a study designed by a monster. This guy, Wendell Johnson. He was an American psychologist at the University of Iowa in Iowa. The overall goal of the study was to determine if a child's severe stutter could be cured through positive reinforcement and encouragement. Well, that doesn't seem too bad. Oh wait, no, the study also wanted to see if a stutter could be created from being verbally abused.
Today, Junior?
Well, that changes things completely. Those chosen for the study were, of course, innocent, wide-eyed, adorable orphans, which apparently are always in great supply for such a situation. 22 orphans, ages 5 to 15, were ultimately chosen, being divided into groups based on speech ability. 10 of the children were considered stutterers, and 12 children had no stutter at all. The study aimed to see how both positive and negative influences affected the presence of a stutter. So, to cover all of the grounds, the study looked like this. The children were divided into 4 groups. Group 1A, 6 non-stuttering children being told, "Good job for being such good speakers." Group 2A, 6 non-stuttering children being told that they were beginning to develop a stutter, which they weren't, and told to get their shit together. Group 1B consisted of 5 stuttering children that were told that their stutters were nothing but a phase and that they'll eventually get over it. And finally, Group 2B, 5 stuttering children who were constantly reprimanded for their inability to speak well. It's noted that only groups 2A and 1B were seen as interesting and critical to the research as it would directly challenge the overall theory. Can you cure a stutter? Can you force a stutter? The experiments, though designed by Wendell Johnson, were conducted by University of Iowa graduate student Mary Tudor. Not this Mary Tudor, the psychopathic Queen of England, this Mary Tudor. She executed the study following only an approved script written by Johnson. Each week, she would talk with the children and document their progress. Group 1B stutterers were told that they would, quote, outgrow the stuttering and they would be able to speak much better than they are speaking now. Pretty wholesome. 10 out of 10. On the other side of the spectrum, Group 2A's non-stutterers were basically smacked upside their skulls, being told that their teachers complained about their speech problems and that they must immediately be corrected by, quote, doing anything to keep from stuttering. Don't ever speak unless they can do it right. The orphanage teachers were also in on the gig, being given specific instructions to reinforce these ideas to the students as part of the fully encompassing scientific study, which lasted 5 months. The demeanor of Group 2A's children changed almost immediately. Once considered normal speaking with little to no issues, these children were now terrified to speak. They became withdrawn and hesitant, and some only really spoke with 1 or 2 word responses. Kind of like a bad date. So, how was your day? Good. Okay, how's your chicken parm? Good. Is your phone good too? Good. Okay, this isn't gonna work. Good. The children would even go as far as to punish themselves for any mistakes they made and would even isolate themselves from the other children. One 12-year-old girl even ended up running away from the orphanage completely. In the end, no child from Group 2A actually developed a stutter, but the psychological damage had still been done, with the children's communication skills being thrown into the toilet, which reportedly continued throughout their entire lives. They couldn't even tell their parents how much they loved them. As for the other groups, there was no statistically significant change in their speech quality. So, we have our answers. Can you cure a stutter by being nice? No. Can you force a stutter by being a dick? No. But you can cause long-term psychological stress by degrading and verbally abusing children. What a surprise. Okay, easy time's over. Time to really crank up the evil. The Holmesburg prison in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania in the United States was home to some pretty nasty human experiments from 1951 all the way to 1974. Post-World War II, all hats were off for the sake of scientific advancement. Pharmaceutical industry budgets had skyrocketed and a new gold rush was created. Ethics were glossed over, informed consent was virtually non-existent, and medical safety protocols were shoved aside for the sake of progress. Medical doctors were kind of just told to try some stuff out and see what sticks. After all, you don't want those evil Soviets to get ahead in the Cold War, do you? Now, some of you more savvy historians might ask, well, what about the Nuremberg Code of 1947, which outright banned such human experiments? Well, American scientists waved their freedom fingers and said, no. See, that code was for the gross bad Nazi guys over there. We Americans would never do something like that. No. Never. Anyway, here, try this new pill. It might cure cancer, it might make you smell colors. We haven't perfected it yet, but trust us, it'll do something. Experiments performed in the Holmesburg prison ranged from applying simple cosmetics to make everyone look pretty, to exposure to corrosive and carcinogenic chemical weapons to make everyone look pretty dead. These experiments were funded by several large corporations, including Johnson & Johnson, the Dow Chemical Company, and even the US Army. Some people have rainy day funds, mega corporations have evil experiment funds. Perfectly balanced. Though it has to be said that these experiments were entirely voluntary, with prisoners being paid a few bucks here and there for their time and potential sacrifice. But when an individual is so desperate for money as to sell themselves to inhumane trials, is it really voluntary? Well, yeah, here's your $2. Same time tomorrow? One of the head honchos over there was American dermatologist Dr. Albert Kligman. When he entered the Holmesburg prison for the first time, he was quoted saying that all he saw before him were acres of skin. It was like a farmer seeing a fertile field for the first time. So that right there, that's an obvious red flag. That's not a normal thought that you should have. Inmate records described experiments including exposure to various STDs, skin blistering chemicals, radiation, psychoactive drugs, and carcinogenic compounds. The most famous being dioxins, which would become a key ingredient for Agent Orange, an herbicide which is known to have directly killed over 700,000 American and Vietnamese people during the Vietnam War. But that's another story. Not really. The US developed an herbicide that directly killed over 700,000 people during the Vietnam War. So, prisoners were poked, prodded, sliced, sewn, exposed, drugged, you name it. But this wasn't just happening in Holmesburg. Inmates, along with other, quote, throwaway humans, like those in mental hospitals all over the United States, were nothing but lab rats to the medical community. That's all the value they had left as humans. At least, that was the general consensus at the time. Prisoners would line up day in and day out to see what the new test of the day was and how much free cash they could get out of it. Yeah, I heard they'll slap your balls for $5. Oh, neat. I'm usually the one paying for that one. One prisoner by the name of Withers Ponton noted how he was laid on a table where two doctors cut open his lower back. They proceeded to stuff him with medical gauze and sewed him back up, only to remove the gauze 10 days later with no idea what they were really doing it for. But he got $10 out of it for each cut. So worth it. When the 1970s rolled around, it was estimated that over 90% of the prison's population had participated in at least one test. It was also at this time that the attitude towards human experimentation shifted to kind of like maybe that's a bad thing to do. Although many great scientific advancements were achieved through these experiments, it left the subjects scarred for life, both physically and mentally. But let me ask you this, would you trust that a medicine would work in theory on paper, or would you rather have it be proven to work by shoving weird pills into real human subjects? There's medical research, and then there's just plain evil torture. Since you're watching a video about evil experiments, you've probably heard of Josef Mengele, also known as the Angel of Death, and arguably one of the most evil men in human history. Sure, Adolf the red-nosed dickhead was the big stinky cheese of the whole Nazi operation, but remember that there were monsters that willingly and enthusiastically carried out his orders. Mengele was one of such monsters. He was a World War II German SS officer and physician at Birkenau, a part of the Auschwitz death camp in Poland. Since SS doctors didn't administer any treatment to sick and dying prisoners themselves, Mengele's job was to make sure that the inmate doctors were treating the prisoners to get them back to a working condition. Any prisoners who did not recover within 2 weeks were nonchalantly sent to the gas chambers without hesitation. And that's just a taste of this complete bastard's inconceivable evils. Mengele would use his position of power as an opportunity to satisfy his demented curiosities. After all, he was a medical doctor. Among his greatest interests were people with heterochromia iridium, meaning that they had two different color eyes, very popular amongst the anime fangirls, people with dwarfism and other physical abnormalities, and perhaps his strongest interest being identical twins. Mengele had handpicked over 1,500 subjects, mostly children, who would be spared the gas chamber and even fed and housed better than the normal death camp population, but at a terrible cost. An inmate doctor under Mengele was quoted saying that he was capable of being so kind to the children, to have them become fond of him, to bring them sugar, to think of small details in their daily lives, and to do things we would genuinely admire. And then, next to that, the crematoria smoke. And these children, tomorrow or in a half hour, he's gonna send them there. Well, that is where the anomaly lay. Such a human so void of empathy is truly horrifying, because you just never know what they are really capable of and how far they will go to accomplish their own selfish goals. His experimental designs had zero consideration for the health, safety, or the physical, mental, or emotional impact on the victims. He was given full control to do as he pleased. For his twin patients, he often performed his experiments on one twin and treated the other as a control for a direct comparison of results. Experiments included the amputation of healthy limbs, forceful injection of disease, blood transfusions, removal of teeth and organs without anesthesia, and even creating his own Siamese twins by sewing two children together. Perhaps one of his more infamous pieces of work was injecting adrenaline directly into eyeballs to change their color. The eyeballs would be removed from living victims and studied, with some being pinned to his wall as trophies. Once experiments were completed, he would kill off and dissect the control twin to report any findings. Out of his 1,500 victims, only 200 reportedly survived. Keep in mind that Mengele wasn't even the highest ranking medical officer or even in a relatively high position of power. There were many other evil doctors who performed their own experiments on victims. Karl Claudeberg had researched mass sterilization by radiation and chemical injection, contributing to the sterilization of over 400,000 people. Sigmund Rascher had researched the human limits and treatments of hypothermia and exposure to low and high pressure environments. Hans Eppinger had forced starving and dehydrated prisoners to drink filtered seawater to determine drinkability. Karl Valnetz had claimed to have developed a cure for homosexuality with testosterone-based implants and forced castration. There were dozens of other medical officers who conducted these human experiments, many of whom escaped prosecution after Germany had fallen in World War II. Mengele, like many other SS officers, fled to Argentina after the war was over. He evaded capture and survived until 1979 when, while doing a backstroke in the ocean, suffered a front stroke and drowned, left to float in the ocean like the piece of shit he was. In all, there were about 16,000 documented victims of human experimentation by the Germans, with about a quarter succumbing to their suffering. But it is unknown what the true number of experiment victims may be.